I probably don't even need this. Oh, there we go. Now you can tell it's on. All right. Well, while Jeff gets set up, we'll get started here. Hello, everyone. My name is Trevor Dotson, and I am the I am the manager of operations at the Charlevoix Historical Society. Jeff is the president. Our speaker today is the president of the Historical Society, Geoffrey Reynolds. Geoffrey is a Charlevoix native and once served as the executive director of the Charlevoix Historical Society Museum at Harsha House from 1989 to 1993. In 2022, Geoffrey retired from the Joint Archives of Holland at Hope College in Holland, Michigan, where for 21 of his 25 years, he was the Mary Riepma Ross Director with the rank of professor. He has written numerous papers and articles about boat building, and that's a topic he does not only write about, but is also active in, where he's building or refurbishing small boats in his free time. I hope you enjoy his presentation this evening, Mayhem at Midnight, the disaster aboard the Propeller Champlain. And if you would like to learn more about Charlevoix's maritime history, please stop by the museum at Harsha House to see our exhibit, A Maritime History of Charlevoix, the City on Three Lakes. The museum is open Monday through Saturday from noon to 4 from now until Labor Day. And with that, I will turn it over to the president of the Historical Society, Geoffrey Reynolds.
Thank you, Trevor. So Brian's gonna tweak things if it gets too annoying. Let's try the laser. Good. All right. Well, first of all, thank you for coming. I see a lot of friends, and I've heard that there are a lot of Sharrows. Is it the Sharrow family or Wakefields, which is a person we're going to talk a little bit more about as we get going. So that was kind of a goal. It was to bring in some of the survivor and non-survivor families to try to pull together some of the facts that I was not able to find. As I was speaking with the young lady earlier, the Wakefield descendants, she's one of the hardest ones to find information on until lately. I did this back in the 80s, and then I just ran into all these walls and research institutions because the connections had not been made through the internet, which with genealogy is amazing. So there's a few things I would like to discuss futuristically when I get done about how maybe we can find more of those. But again, the DNA testing is kind of a hot topic right now, so we can talk a little bit about that later. So let's talk about the Champlain. The Propeller Champlain was launched in Ogdensburg, New York in 1870 and was worth $55,000 when it was launched. It was originally part of the Chamberlain fleet of 22 steamers constituting the Northern Transportation Line, which was a big part of the connections we had to the world. Her original route included Chicago to Ogdensburg and ports in between. Described as a compact, well-built canal steamer of good power and speed, she enjoyed success with the Chamberlains until competition forced him to sell every vessel in the line except the Champlain and the St. Albans. The latter sank uninsured in 1881 due to ice off Milwaukee. Broke by loss, Chamberlain sold the Champlain to investors. Seymour inclined to join the Lawrence and form the Northern Michigan line of Chicago, retaining its white hull and cabins with green trim and black stack with white top color scheme. I found there's probably 4 images of the Champlain when it was intact and probably 6 of it when it was not, and we'll talk about that. We're lucky that we have images like this, even though this is not Charlevoix. It's one of the beautiful shots of it on this is kind of what Round Lake would have looked like in 1887, this working waterfront. In 1885, several $1,000s were spent rebuilding her, and her decks were replaced during the following winter for $2,000 more. Her engine and boiler rooms were lined with galvanized iron as a precaution against fire, which will be somewhat ironic later on in the program. With the Champlain went the first mate, Edward Casey. Upon entering the new company, he was assigned to the command of the St. Albans, which was lost within the first hour of his first command. It must be noted that he was cleared of any wrongdoing concerning her sinking. Ironically, he was then awarded the position of captain aboard the Champlain in 1883, the lone remaining vessel in the fleet. In June 1887, the Propeller Champlain was rated A2, A1 being the best, at 456 tons. According to Lloyd's Register, it was valued at $30,000 with a fire risk of $21,500. On June 16, 1887, the ill-fated Propeller left Milwaukee, this is the harbor of Milwaukee, for ports on the eastern shore of Lake Michigan, with Mr. Schaub of Rochester, Wisconsin, bound for Charlevoix and on to Boyne City to see his son, Mr. Whitman of Frankfurt, Lieutenant Judson Rogers and his 6-year-old son, Leon, for Fort Mackinac, where he was a medic, Mr. Schomberry to Glen Haven. Later that day, she left the Buffalo Street dock in Chicago, bound for Sheboygan, intermediate ports, with Mary Anderson to Traverse City, Mary Wakefield to Charlevoix, Mrs. Michael Kehoe and her daughter, Mabel, to Charlevoix, Wolf Sampson to McKinsey, Ella Wilson to Petoskey, George Miller to Charlevoix, and Mrs. Ella Cooper Smith to Charlevoix, Mrs. Bedford to Charlevoix, and James Bishop to Charlevoix. Lake Michigan was calm and the weather was clear. The Champlain left Frankfurt with a full load of passengers that included George Risley of Charlevoix, Robert Wilkes of Charlevoix, Antoine Sherrill, Fred Risley of Charlevoix, who had been working for the L.E. Allen on harbor improvements in that area. This forced Charles Wright of Petoskey and Edward Cocher to stay behind. There was no room. Allen also missed the boat, but his equipment was loaded with his men. After stopping at Elk Rapids at 7 p.m., she tied up at Norwood about 10:30 p.m. for wood for the steam engine. There were a lot of small towns like Elk Rapids, Charlevoix, and Norwood, where you would have to stop and get fuel. Coal, oil, gas, that was not being used yet. At 10:45 p.m., the vessel disembarked the dock and headed back out into Lake Lake Michigan, slowly turning north after reaching 3 miles distance between her and Fisherman's Island. So here's our Norwood. And then as you go up, this is where she will have her first encounter with the bottom. And then these are important sites that I'll be talking about: Smithson's Lumber Camp, Fisherman's Island, South Point, which you're all aware of where St. Mary's Cement is, and then Charlevoix, and then North Point. Her next stop was Charlevoix, with Captain Casey hoped to reach a little after midnight. At watch forward with Casey was the Champlain second mate, James Thorpe. Among those aboard, a crew of 29 were working or sleeping. Among the 27 passengers, those bound for Charlevoix lounged or prepared their belongings to disembark, enjoying the steady 11 miles per hour rate that would bring them to the shore soon. On her starboard side, the abandoned landmass, known as Fisherman's Island, loomed in the distance. This gives you the land. This is where the Champlain is at and where she will be going. Further in the distance, the lights of Smithson's Lumber Camp, about 1 mile south of the island, were burning as the men likely prepared for bed. Nearby, the crew of the schooner was seen. Oops. I'll just show you this. This is the Smithson Lumber Camp, the only image that has also survived. of that camp south of there. This is a Burns photo, another great Charlevoix family. This is what the Racine would have looked like. A schooner, very common. They would have come to the shores and then loaded lumber and then pulled off like a skiff. Nearby, the crew of the schooner Racine were sound asleep since entering their berths around 8 p.m. after a hard day of loading lumber. At about 11:30 p.m., a sleeping fireman, Charles A. Lakecombe, was awakened by a lantern dropping to the floor near his bed and igniting the room, the one that's encased in iron. After a futile battle with the fire, his face and arms burned. He rushed from the room and through the engine room, alerting the crew. At 11:40 p.m., the captain was startled by the sight of the chief engineer, John McCaffrey, a fire. He too had tried to quell the flames and failed. Quickly, Casey directed McCaffrey to immerse himself in a water tank kept on the hurricane deck, which is the upper part of the boat. It was then he first saw the cause of the man's condition. Around the smokestack, flames were licking skyward at a steady pace. Many of the passengers were aroused from their slumber or lounging by a commotion on the deck. Soon the general alarm ordered by the captain confirmed the worst. The boat was on fire. Once the alarm was given, Captain Casey ordered the engine stopped. About 6 miles south of Charlevoix, lifting himself from the water tank, McCaffrey went back below decks to answer the captain's order, but to no avail. The fire was now raging out of control with no hope of reaching the engine's throttle. Confronted with only one option, Captain Casey ordered the propeller headed for the island and the 2 forward lifeboats and 1 life raft lowered. With this strategy, he hoped to ground the vessel as close to the shore as possible for his passengers to reach safety. Unfortunately, the boats and raft quickly swamped due to the vessel's excessive speed and the burning of the lifeboat's guidelines as the ship's whistle screamed into the night. Faced with the loss of the lifeboats and the raft, the crew were ordered to throw anything that might float into the water for the passengers to use for flotation. While this being done, the passengers continued donning their life jackets for the inevitable leap into the cold water as the wind fanned the flames from the stern of the boat closer and closer to the bow. While this is a picture of the Phoenix, this same thing happened to the Phoenix off Wisconsin. This is a famous burning, very ironic if you think of the name, that killed a lot of Dutch in the Holland area and Wisconsin area. Same problem. Cannot get to the control room. And then as you see the crowds go to each end of the boat thinking what's gonna happen. Unfortunately, there was no lifeboat in the Champlain scenario. They had all obviously been lost. Unfortunately, many of the passengers were unable to obtain life preservers or put them on incorrectly and were eventually lost when they entered the water one by one. The captain was the last to leave the Champlain after securing the screaming ship's whistle with an oar. The rope had long burned away and he had hoped that the whistle would bring help from the shore or nearby vessels. This proved correct as the startled men from Smithson's lumber camp raced to the shore to see the flames of the vessel in the distance, grounded on a reef extending out from the island under the direction, I'm a little ahead of myself, I'm sorry. Under the direction of the camp supervisor, George Lee Burns. Lumbermen became rescuers as they made their way to survivors by using a large wooden raft. Another raced aboard the fully loaded schooner Racine to alert the crew. After the racing to the deck and seeing the flaming wreck of the southwest, the schooner's master, Captain Jacob Hansen, directed his steward, a man named Wendt, and crew members to use the Racine's yawl, a small boat, while he and the lumbermen used the raft for rescue efforts. Once the crew and passengers of the Champlain entered the 12 feet of water, The struggle for survival began, only made worse by the darkness, fog, and rain. The night had started out calm and clear, but as they traveled through the night, the weather descended into a dark, cold night. And I was only able to find that out through the Bureau of War kept weather reports very clearly in those years. And I looked at the 2 days and it showed the progression over the evening of that happening. Some of the passengers and captain didn't even remember what the weather was. It was into the water, and then everything just kind of went blank in the way of description of because they were asked those questions. Many struck out for the nearby island a mile distant. So you figure they're out here, and there's a shoal even farther out, the 1 mile shoal that they hit. And this was the goal. So the light of the ship, the fire, must have lit up the outline of the island enough for Casey to know, well, it's at least something where they can get to it, but he never got close enough. And Smithson's is over here, which this is what it would have looked like to the Smithson's lumber crew. They would have seen the boat out here. You can only imagine if you see this thing way out here, are they going to get there in time? But again, once they get to the island, then the passengers have to get to here. So, I mean, it's a daunting task. 59-degree water, it's dark, it's stormy. You're in street clothes at best. Some of the men that survived the easiest just stripped down to their underwear and jumped in because they figured, well, it's less weight. But then you have the hypothermia that will grasp or take hold of you as well. So it's just a terrible situation. I mean, on a good day, I wouldn't want to do that. I can imagine midnight, what you've just been through, maybe burned, people are screaming, the chaos of death everywhere. Captain Casey and Mate Bishop and his son SF left the vessel last while others remained, clutching fenders near the flaming hull for warmth until being rescued. So think of your options. Into the water where you might drown because you don't have a life preserver on. There's nothing to grasp onto other than maybe something that's still on the boat that you can hold on to because at least you're warm. And some of them, that's how they survived. I can't even imagine what that would have been like. We were left with nothing but flames and water. Either one looked almost like certain death, and we had come to a standstill, having run on the sand a mile from the island and 2 miles from the shore in 12 feet of water, recalled William Albright, a traveling salesman from the Sherwin-Williams Paint Company. He described George Miller jumping first, with many following his lead. George Miller is a local gentleman. Albright liberated the boat's jackstaff and followed Charles H. Russell, a salesman for the Jackson Corset Company, as he jumped. As both clung on the staff, they headed for the island with 2 other survivors. After 90 minutes in the water, Russell became too cold to continue and told Albright he was heading back to the wreck for warmth. He would later be found on the beach, dead. Captain Hansen had seen him upside down in the water with his life preserver below his waist. Albright was eventually picked up by the Racine's yawl after being passed over twice. So you can imagine the chaos. You're trying to put on the primitive life preservers of 1887, and then you get it wrong. And then you're in the water 90 minutes, 59-degree water. Hypothermia is what, 20 minutes on a good day? I think that's the number. The third time, George Miller insisted that the rescuers add Albright, their sorry cargo headed for the island. This plea probably saved Albright's life. The other passengers in the boat included 7 indigenous deckhands from Elk Rapids, none of which were ever identified or counted among the living or the dead by the newspapers. In fact, historians have listed them as deceased and buried in Potter's Field in Charlevoix Brookside Cemetery, which is not true. They were literally on the boat alive and then they disappeared. So one of the biggest mysteries I have with this story is, where did the indigenous men of Elk Rapids go? Did they just get to shore and go home? It would have been for them a walk, yes. It's just one of the many mysteries that the papers didn't address. Another harrowing account came from the steward, Martin Bowe, and his wife, as they leapt into the water, each with a young daughter, Ella and Agnes. After discovering the daughter she had died, Mrs. Bowe released her grip and let the youngster sink in order to save herself. After reaching her husband and the remaining apparently lifeless child, the decision was made to release her also to the water. Suddenly the child would say, "Papa, I don't want to die yet." Gaining new strength with these words, he set out again for the island with her on his shoulder. He was then relieved by the second cook, Jack Hartley. Later, both cook and child were found drowned. Other stories include Miss Mary Wakefield. Wakefield seizing the child of a traveling companion, an invalid, Mrs. Kehoe. As the mother slipped beneath the waves and she waited for a fender to fall from the burning hulk, she clenched the child's clothing in her teeth. After a fender's lines burned through, she dropped next to into the water, picking up the, After a fender's lines burned through and dropped next to her in the water, she clutched it and then placed the child upon it, then set out for the island, picking up ship steward Henry Bowe along the way. That's the brother of the father who had just lost both of his children. Once ashore, she tore her skirts loose and wrapped Bowe to prevent hypothermia. He had stripped to his undergarments in an attempt to lighten himself for the swim to shore. Wakefield's act probably saved the steward's life. It's 2 people she saved that night. Only 5 survivors, including the captain, reached the safety of the island unassisted. There they were transported to the camp, 1 mile distant, by its employees, only to have Captain Casey return to help with the rescue efforts. He tried saving the ship's clerk, Henry W. Brennan, by rolling him back and forth upon a log to force the water from his lungs. But to no avail. He died aboard Captain Hansen's raft as it left the island. Earlier that day, before boarding the boat, Brennan had told his friends of a premonition that he had that the Champlain would meet with disaster that very same day. Captain Casey continued looking for survivors until boarding the tug that would tow his smoldering charge to Charlevoix later that morning. That night, 29 souls were lost to burns, hypothermia, and improper life vest adjustments. One, Mrs. Ella Smith, was seen kneeling on the deck of the ship, praying with the flames creeping on her. She then leapt into the water after her sister, Mrs. Harrison Bedford, but did not survive the fall as her neck was broken upon impact. According to witnesses, her body would be picked up early Friday morning by local fishermen. As the yawl and raft returned to the lumber camp with their sorrowful cargo, they hustled the burned and hypothermic survivors into a large log building. Around 3 a.m., local physician J.A. Carlstein, roused from sleep by messenger from the lumber camp, was quickly conveyed by buggy to the camp. Others in the nearby towns were awakened by telephone calls asking for additional doctors and transportation to nearby Charlevoix. Soon, tugs and wagons were dispatched to the camp. Only McCaffrey stayed due to the severity of his burns and the possibility of death if moved. Captain Casey returned from Charlevoix to spend 4 to 5 hours per day changing McCaffrey's dressings until he was able to be moved to Charlevoix. The next week, McCaffrey's mother arrived from Manistee, Michigan, to help with his care at the Fountain City House, a local boarding house. This is where the Weather Vane hotel sits now. As others searched for bodies, Captain Casey accompanied the smoldering ship aboard the tug that towed it to the South Pier at the head of Charlevoix. Pierhead at Charlevoix. This is one of those photos I was telling you about. Once there, the local fire department poured water on the Champlain with their steam-powered pumper, the Silsby steamer. You can just see it. It's on the tug to the right. If you can just see that steam, that's the steam engine that is drawing water out of the channel and then spraying the boat. When I first saw these when I was much younger, I was amazed that the boat was still in such great shape. I mean, you usually burn to the water line. There's a phrase, because that's where the water is. This stopped right at the hull. And then you can see some of the burn marks on the front, but otherwise it did very well. Once extinguished, the hulk was towed through Pine River Channel and into Round Lake, where she was grounded near Campbell Shipyard. She was inspected by insurance personnel and valued at $4,000. Still worth $4,000 a few days later. So this is what they found when they started looking. And this is where they found the man's foot, which they weren't able, there weren't any bodies without feet, so they're not sure. I have a list of people that might have been on the boat, crew and passengers, that I still had to find either dead or alive somewhere else. They might be some of what this is. Among this wasteland are horses, cargo for the town, gears and things from the ship itself, the boiler. And then there's very distinctive nails of the ship. This would have been the inside of the ship, or the ceiling boards of a boat that had burned away and left the outside hull intact, which is really interesting. These are just young men from the area. And then there's Charlevoix's north side in the distance there. The only surviving photographs of the hull were taken by local photographer Dan S. Way and were available for sale to the crowds that gathered to see firemen sort through the smoldering hull for bodies. I mean, it must have been the news of the day to have some of these photos. This is the other man that was there. This is Perkins. He had a Charlevoix office, but also he was a Grand Rapids photographer. This just came available last week. I came across this and I yelled to Trevor as we both were in the museum. Here's one I haven't seen. And then our local photo historian, Ole Lingclip, said that is a very interesting photo. That was one he had not seen. But again, same shot as the DS Way stuff, but just a different view of it. While a human foot was discovered, it was never fully confirmed that it was attached to a passenger or crew member at the time. Some interviewed for newspaper stories speculated that it was from the missing ship fireman, first named Lewis, but his body was recovered and buried locally with no mention of a missing foot. So there are details that maybe they didn't say foot. I mean, we'll never really know. Soon after departing the scene of the smoldering vessel, Captain Casey walked into town and telegraphed J.F. Burke, agent of the Chicago office of the Northern Michigan Line and part owner, who then telephoned the ship's principal owner, P.J. Klein of Milwaukee. Casey made direct contact via telegraph soon after and related the following. Champlain burned off Charlevoix at 12 o'clock last night. 8 persons are known to have drowned. Clerk Brennan died shortly after we got him ashore. That was it. That was the only thing he said. It was just probably a man in shock. Soon after Klein boarded the train for Chicago, boarded a train for Chicago and on to Charlevoix, the office received many inquiries as to the validity and the descriptions of the disaster and the number of passengers who had perished, ranging from 22 to 30, depending on which newspaper you read. And I found that as well. Burke eventually made the journey north while Klein awaited word in Chicago. As daylight broke, hundreds of local residents searched the lake beach for the dead. Local vessels began the grisly job of retrieving bodies from the water and the beach and on the island. John O'Neill's fish tug were the first to find remnants of the Champlain's human cargo. They included Mrs. Ella Cooper Smith and Captain Lucas of Petoskey. Other vessels continued searching throughout the day, eventually recovering a 47-year-old Lieutenant Judson Rogers with identification papers, Charles Russell, cabin boy Edward Wilkins, and second cook Jack Hartley, who had the young Bow girl. In Charlevoix, the vacant store of Morris J. Stockman became the temporary morgue for the bodies. Here, survivors and friends came to identify the dead when taken on peculiar poses, such as praying in pure horror. As the week progressed, more bodies were recovered and brought to Charlevoix for identification. On Saturday, they brought in Robert Wilkes, Frank Risley of Charlevoix, Casper Schaub of Wisconsin, William Sansom, a young boy from Chicago, and the nameless Lewis, the fireman from the boat. This is Sansom's obituary, which appeared in the Streeter, Illinois paper. This was just discovered because of the internet. I love the internet. As an archivist, this is how things should work. Schaub was claimed by his son, J.C. Schaub of Boyne City, and interred there instead of his home in Rochester, Wisconsin, until later. While doing a find a grave search, I noticed that Casper had been dug up and moved. So there was some disinterring that did happen here, but also with Boyne City. He was returned to the Rochester, Wisconsin area. I think there are still Schaubs in Boyne City. One intended passenger, R.M. McKeel of Chicago, had sent his wife ahead to Charlevoix and was to follow aboard the Champlain. After news reached Charlevoix that his body had been found on the island, she quietly began to grieve, but secretly held hope of his rescue. On Saturday, a telegraph dispatch arrived at Charlevoix from Chicago. It read, "I am safe here." Evidently, a mistake had been made with one of the identified bodies, and he was believed dead. So you can imagine the chaos of that first week of people who kind of knew that other guy next to him, but didn't know his name or where he got on. Yeah. On Sunday, the steamer Onekama recovered Mrs. Falls and Ella Bow, the 3-year-old daughter of Martin and Mrs. Bow. Witnesses described the scene as one to move the stoutest heart, as Martin Bow identified his daughter in her peaceful state. Mrs. Falls and Ella Bow were removed by local women, prepared for burial, and interred locally the next afternoon. They would also be moved. The Bow's 5-year-old daughter, Agnes, would not be recovered until the following Thursday, June 23rd, along with Lulu Willard near Middle Village. The drift obviously was north for that week. Once the bodies were recovered, friends and family began shipping the deceased back to their homes or preparing them for funerals locally. Charles Russell's body was quickly taken in charge by the local Knights Templar organization of Charlevoix, embalmed and shipped back to Jackson, Michigan to be buried. While the bodies of Judson Rogers and his son Leon, found near Petoskey on June 24th, were packed in ice and transported to Fort Mackinac. This is where they're buried now, at the Post Cemetery on the right. I've been there a few times. He had a widow and a mom they left behind at the fort. Henry Brennan was preserved this way and sent to Chicago. Edward Wilkins from Madison, Wisconsin, and Jack Hartley of Chicago, while from other towns, were interred in Charlevoix's Brookside Cemetery by local pastors, which makes my work a little harder, finding them. Hartley, who was really a young man named Thomas Burke, who wanted to work on the lakes, was later identified by his parents, Mr. and Mrs. Patrick Burke. After he was disinterred in August, he was reburied in Elgin, Illinois. William Sampson's father arrived the following Tuesday from Illinois to claim his son. Local families also undertook the job of burying their dead. Miss Ella Cooper, the Coopers owned the Fountain City House, that hotel. And Robert Wilkes received funerals on Sunday at the Methodist Church. George Risley was interred at Boyne City, and Lewis, the fireman, at Charlevoix. 2 weeks later, all the victims except the indigenous crew had been discovered. Some were up to 35 miles from the disaster. On Monday, June 20th, owner Burke wrote in a telegram to his partner Klein, "This has been a day of mourning here, as the erroneous report of 22 dead, 14 passengers, and 8 crew was released. The next day, Burke had already begun negotiations to acquire a replacement vessel for the route. In an interview, he was quoted as saying, "This disaster will make no change in our plans. We shall come out in the spring of '88 in better shape than ever." Ironically, the local Charlevoix Sentinel's newspaper ran the weekly advertisement for the Champlain schedule until the ill-fated Vernon of the same line from the Booth line of Chicago was contracted to continue. Business as usual, everybody, right? Soon after the disaster, a coroner's jury was impaneled by Justice McLeod and charged with investigating this calamity. They eventually found the crew free of negligence in the matter. It was also judged that the victims had either drowned or died of exposure to the cold temperatures of the water. 2 weeks after the disaster, Captain Casey accepted the command of a new ship being built in Milwaukee. The remains of the Champlain were rebuilt and lengthened to 165 feet and re-entered the service, ironically, as the city of Charlevoix in 1888. In 1892, she received a new steam engine. The city of Charlevoix later burned in 1894, again, was rebuilt as the Kansas in 1906. The Kansas also burned in Manistee in October 1927, but not rebuilt, ending the fiery history of the original Champlain. The stories of the surviving shipwreck, the stories of surviving a shipwreck are generally reported about 1 week, and then the media moves on to the next story. I think we found this when the sub disappeared on the Titanic. This flurry of information for a week, and then the courts get involved, right? I chose to continue the researching and discovered a few interesting stories. I've always been fascinated by the lone survivors of a ship. It's the last person, they get a week's worth of media and then they just disappear. Dennis Hale of the Merrill, for years an alcoholic from the trauma that he of living, being the only one. Frank May, one of the few that lasted on the Bradley. It's a very tough life. So I was very interested in knowing what happened to these people when they left. You know, what happened? The first one is William Albright, the Sherwin-Williams paint salesman. After being taken to Charlevoix, he boarded a boat the next day and continued on to Cleveland. He later became a director of the company. George Washington Miller returned to selling clothing. He had lost, I think, $500 worth of clothing on that ship and had to put a newspaper ad asking for people to pay their bills in Charlevoix so he could continue to go on. He continued to be a men's clothier until 1910 at the time of his death. He died a widower in Traverse City and is buried in Brookside Cemetery. And then we have Antoine Sherrill, a very interesting gentleman. Later in life, Antoine Sherrill was a ship's carpenter. He had been working on that breakwall in the Frankfurt area. That's why he was on the ship and he was coming home. He died on November 3rd, 1909, and is buried in Brookside Cemetery. The only known artifact from the Champlain to survive is the steering pole from the bow, which is what we have at the museum now. Somehow, Sherrill or family members acquired it. preserved and donated it to the Historical Society in 2001. I remember when that happened. What a thrill to see that. David was very happy to see that. It's in the pictures of the boat out on the South Pier, but if you didn't notice when it was in the harbor, it was gone. So I can't imagine why Cheryl would have gotten it. He didn't use it to float. It stayed a part of the boat. It has a hinge, which is why it hinged that night and stayed on the boat. It's used when you come into a channel. When the cabin on a steamer is too far forward, you lose perspective of the ship, meaning you don't know, there's more of it behind you than in front of you, so you lose perspective of steerage. So they used it as a steerer. So they would fold it up, and on days when they weren't going under bridges or in tight quarters, and the captain could look out the window and see the steerer and then point it down the channel. That would give him a sight line. And so then it would hinge down when it was in the way. Thankfully, it hinged down that night and stayed on board. Otherwise, we wouldn't have it. The jack staff, which was reported as being a flotation device, that's another part of the boat that is obviously missing. There's another one of those photos that only the newspaper had, and Ole Linklip was able to give Antoine Cheryl more of a face than the newspaper even did. And the Sherrills are still a family in Charlevoix. This is a cool one too. 24-year-old William Stevens. If anybody know Dudley Stevens or the former or the late William Stevens, this is their ancestor. I can see Dudley there a little bit. The ears maybe not, but yeah. This is his young ancestor. 24-year-old William Stevens left the livery business with his brother Joseph after the event and entered the lumber trade with Harrison Bedford, the husband of fellow survivor Mrs. Minnie Cooper Bedford. And I think this is where the family lore for the Stevens family started, according to Dudley. According to the family lore, William Stevens saved Mrs. Bedford, which he didn't. The wheelsman William Barr saved her. So Dudley and I had that discussion. So that's what they said. Well, it's not true. And I can tell. I can't tell. 2 years after the Champlain disaster, he married and moved to Petoskey. This house is still there. I went and looked at it the other day. And later in North Carolina to raise his family as a lumberman. He died in Bryson City, North Carolina in 1907 at the age of 44. And then they all came back. The Stevenses weren't even here in the early part of the 20th century. They came back. I believe Bill, the contractor, was born in the Carolinas. And lastly, Mary Wakefield. After rescuing the small Kehoe child and Henry Bow, she remained living in Marion Township before eventually moving to St. Augustine, Florida, where she died in 1941 at the age of 71. So she would be the oldest living survivor, in my estimation, at age 71 of the tragedy. I would have loved to interview her. Oh, the drive to award her a life-saving medal from the United States Treasury Department evidently failed, and nothing was ever mentioned of the award after October 1887. There was even a local, I think, drive to give her something. And speaking to her relative tonight, I wonder if there was some money raised that she was then given. Because it seems from what the family's saying, she traveled. So she had some money to move and travel. Maybe that was what happened to Mary Wakefield. I found her on Find a Grave. This is the only time I've ever seen this. Finding a photo of Mary Wakefield is the next big challenge for all of us. There's one photo of her in a club photo that Trevor has that I found maybe 6 months ago. Trevor published it. That might be the only image I know of Mary Wakefield, but she is the true hero, along with Captain Casey of this event. And this is where history gets a little bit muddy. In 1977, the Charlevoix Historical Society obtained a large fieldstone and purchased a plaque to dedicate the 15 unknown souls buried in Brookside Cemetery's Potter's Field. Have any of you ever gone to Potter's Field? It's because they put it always in the back. Or this one is across the river on that little bridge on the end of Bryant. If you go down there, you'll see that. And then you got to go around the corner and look under the hedge, which is where these graves are. It's just somewhat disappointing that we treat them like that. I remember this. I was living in Charlevoix in 1977, and I remember this going down there. I was a young member and seeing that, and it was a wide open field. There's a bush hanging over it now. This is what it looks like now. I mean, it's just pushed off in the corner. Our plaque looks great. But this is where some of the funny things that I noticed. I took this today. There's 15 graves, and we only have 8 missing Indigenous men, and they lived, or 7. There's a veteran's flag on one of these. And there are 3 women buried here, according to the county's records. So somebody wasn't looking at the records when they were doing this dedication, because those 15 people are more than likely not very many Champlain deceased. I think Fireman Lewis is in here. I know that there's a gentleman in there who was a veteran who was Charlevoix's first suicide, believe it or not, is there. And then there are 3 women, or 2 women, and then a young Elias Wabaniki. Not Ken Wabiki, let me look it up, I'm sorry. I want to get that right. 3 women, the 3 people we do know that are in that Potter's Field is Louisa Cordelia Rowan Alvord. She died in 1912. Elizabeth Burton Mason Smith, none of which none of these are natives of Charlevoix. They just were here as married women or widows. She died at 87. And then Elias Wabanimki, the only Indigenous name I found on that list. Age 17, after a 3-year battle with tuberculosis, he passed away. Unfortunately, when you look at the records of the sexton, it doesn't say who's who. So it's 1 through 15, but you don't know who it is. So it's kind of a sad commentary. So, I mean, there is a way to figure this out. It would be very expensive, and it would be somewhat intrusive to take DNA from those bodies or their remains. Maybe. That'd be one way to do it. But I don't think anybody's raised the question yet. So there they'll lie. And then this is a list of the people that were on there, and many of which I didn't mention because there was no comment by them. There was no mention of them. Only maybe a listing that I caught that showed they showed up. So you can see it was quite a diverse group. The crew largely are from Chicago or other ports. And you can see some of the people that passed. Like S.F. Bishop, cannot find anything on him. Ira. And then there's the young Thomas Burke, who was really a runaway. Peter Condon, very little on the Cook. Erastus Fall of Bear Lake, very little on him. Roy Hazelton, not much. Jackson, Mrs. Ingalls of Petoskey, not much. There should be more on her. Mabel Kehoe, this is the young lady that Mrs. Wakefield or Miss Wakefield saved. Mary Kane, a Charlevoix lady we'd have very little on. And then here are some of the Native Americans that passed that were identified. William Kukoosh. And then there's Charles Lacombe, very little on him. Trifley Moran, very little. There's another Native American, Jonah Noboy. Those were all, it's funny, The Suttons Bay crew all passed, but the Elk Rapids indigenous crew did not. So I don't know if they were just in the right place at the wrong time. I'm not sure. And there's a Ogamagageto, and then there's Rogers, Casper Schaub, James Thorpe, nothing on him. Andrew Toffashaw, another indigenous deckhand. Wilkins. Ella Wilson, can't find anything on her. Lulu Willard was the daughter of Mrs. Falls. Whitman, nothing. And then Risley. He survived, his dad passed. And then all I know is that you're Indigenous man number 1 through 7. It's just sad that no one even mentioned their names. But they didn't die. I want to put that on the record. I can't find that they passed. So the number, that's the number I came up with. Out of 29 crew members and 27 passengers, 21 perished and 35 survived, which is a change in the new number. So that's all I have. Is there anything I can answer questions with? Eric Hoffman.
Yeah, you mentioned early in the report here about how the fire started.
Right.
Is there pretty much no question on how the fire started and what there may have been a delay of if the guys saw it?
It's funny, Dudley Stevens said to me, this is the story of how Mrs. Bedford survived and William Stevens did it. And of course I debunked that for him. And then he said, well, my family's probably the one that caught the ship on fire. I said, no, we didn't do that either. It was just an oil lamp hanging on a hook. Something had jostled just wrong. Somebody hit it. It hit the floor. It spread. And even though it was encased in metal of the room, it just wasn't enough. The fact that McCaffrey went back down in that room to he wanted to stop the throttle, because Casey could call for the stopping of the throttle, but he can't do it from the deck. A man below would have heard that in a telegraph and then had to do it physically below. So there was no way to stop the boat, which added to this really big problem of we can't get the boats in the water. And then when they tried, they swamped them, and the 4 Native Americans passed, and then they don't have any ship life-saving at all. I mean, they were gone. So there's no blame found in the coroner's report or anybody else that they had made a bad mistake. Bad design is probably what should be blamed. Yeah. Anybody else? Well, if anybody's on that list, I would love to talk to you to see if there's a connection that we can follow together, because I'd love to put more information behind every one of these people, living or dead. It's just sad that we don't have more. I probably started this a year ago. I got back into it, I should say, after 86. And I just can't find any more. I mean, I'm glad I met one of the Wakefield descendants. That will help us now work on the Wakefields a little bit. But yeah, if any of you have connections to those members on that list, I'd love to talk to you. So thank you for coming. I'll be up here if you want to ask.